Okay, to start this project off, we're going to create a new document. So to do this, we have to choose what kind of document we want to use. I'm going to choose an ActionScript 3 document type because it's easy to preview as a SWF inside of Flash Professional, and we get access to all of the tools available to us. So just clicking on that will create a default document. Now there's a few different document properties that I'm going to want to look over. The first one here is frames per second. 24 is the default. This is okay for now. As we go across the project, we may need to adjust this depending upon how our animation looks. So increasing the frames per second will generally make things appear smoother, but it also impacts the number of frames that it takes along the timeline to actually render the proper amount of animation. The size, so we have a width of 550 pixels and a height of 400 pixels. This is actually the default, and for this particular project, it will work fine. So I'll leave that as it is. The thing I do want to change is this stage color here, because right now it's very white. I prefer the inverse, so I'm going to click on that and choose black. Now you'll notice as I hover over any of these swatches that the stage actually changes dynamically. This is, something you can use to preview exactly what your stage would look like at different colors if you desire. Again, I'll choose black. Now let's save off this document. So I'm going to choose File, Save. And this brings up a little save dialog. Here I can go ahead and select somewhere to save this as. I'm just going to save it to my desktop. And for here, I'll just call it Project 01 and save that off. Immediately it saves for us. Now you might have noticed, and if I choose Save As, that we have two different document types that we can save this as. We have the FLA, Flash document, and an XLF, which is a Flash uncompressed document. The differences here is that a FLA document, which what we saved it as here, is actually a compressed version of an XFL document. Why would you want to use one over the other? An FLA, like we created here, is easily distributable because it's all compacted, compressed into one file format. So anything that we're doing inside of this particular project is going to be included in this FLA file. If you were using something like Subversion or Git, you were checking in code and so forth, or checking in different files that you wanted other people to have raw access to, then you might want to choose XFL because that's an uncompressed format. It'll basically save a bunch of data files alongside all of your images and so forth in the library. And these things would be very easy to check in and out of a source code repository system, version control system like that. So it all depends on if you're working with other people, what's more important to you? The ability to check in incremental portions of your project, or just the convenience of having one FLA file to deal with. Before we start drawing out any of our assets upon the stage, and even attempting some sort of animation, we're going to want to prepare our document and prepare a timeline. So the first thing I usually do is go up to our View menu here, and here you can do things like turn the rulers on and off, which is pretty useful, especially if you're going to be using guides. I'm going to center the stage here by using this button up above the stage. And going back into the View menu, you can see that we can also show our grid. So this allows us to line things up very, very precisely. These grid lines right now, if you want to see how spread apart they are, you can go to View, Grid, and Edit Grid. And you can see that these are each 10 pixels apart. So these are little 10 pixel squares. So if you want to be very precise in terms of how you're actually drawing things out or positioning things in your Flash project, this is one way where you can achieve that very easily. Also in the View menu are guides. So we can show guides here. I don't have any guides at the moment, but to create them, all you need to do is grab, so press down, click on any of the rulers, and then pull them down and place them wherever you want. And the guides will show up as these persistent sort of teal lines here. To get rid of guides, all you need to do is click and drag them off the screen, and they go away. So there are our guides. There's also the option to lock any guides that currently exist, so you don't accidentally move them, and to edit guides. So when you edit guides, you can choose to refine that color, and you can also choose the snap accuracy of the guides. This refers to the ability to have objects, when you're dragging them along, snap automatically to the guides. One of the more important things is, as we just mentioned, snapping. So I always like to turn on all of my snapping options here, but of course this is all up to you. If you find that you want snap to work in certain situations and to be ignored in others, all you need to do is uncheck or check any of these boxes. So we have snap align. This will allow us to align objects to one another by clicking and dragging them in close proximity to one another. We also have snap to grid, which of course works alongside of the grid that we have exposed here. We can snap to guides. So if we have any guides laid out, they will snap to those guides. Snap to pixels I find to be very important. I always snap to pixels. And the reason for that is because inside of Flash Professional, especially if you're working with an ActionScript 3 based format like we are right here, so targeting Flash Player or Air, it will actually allow us to have things at partial pixels. So you can have stuff between full pixels, which is a strange concept for a lot of people, especially if you're coming from another environment. But basically what this will do, snap to pixels, is it'll allow us to make sure that, and when everything snaps, that it actually snaps to whole pixels and not straddling pixels, which can cause issues, especially when working in text. It might render a bit blurry. You also have snap to objects and an edit snapping menu. Let's have a look at that quickly here. So that's all the different options that we already just saw, but we do have this advanced tab, which allows us to tweak things in an advanced way here. So we'll just say OK. And the only other thing that I want to have happen is I want to be able to set up my layers in the timeline. You'll notice that by default we have layer 1. I'm going to double click on that, and then we can edit the name of that layer. So I'm going to call it floor. This will represent the floor that we're going to draw out here that the ball will bounce upon. And then down here we've got these different options. So new layer, new folder, and delete. I'm going to choose new layer to create a new layer directly above my floor layer. Double click on that and type in circle. So that's where our little ball is going to live. Why are we doing this? Well, when we animate things inside of Flash Professional, it's a good idea to have each thing that will be animated on its own unique layer. In some instances, it's absolutely necessary. However, if you are working with a bunch of static objects that you're not animating, like a background, you can always use just one layer for that, and that's fine. Now we're going to go ahead and draw out the floor of our animation. So to do that, we're going to lock down the circle layer so we don't mistakenly add content to that layer, and then choose that first frame on our floor layer. So now anything we draw on the stage at this point is going to exist in there. One thing I am going to do is turn off my grid because it's a little distracting. There we go. And now we can choose a rectangle tool. Now there's two types of rectangle tools. The first one is the normal rectangle tool, where you can define a fill and a stroke. You can also turn on object drawing mode or not. So what this will do, if I turn this off, and then I go ahead and draw something, and then I turn it on and draw something similar, then use the selection tool to have a look at each one, you'll see that this first shape that I did is just a simple shape. This is with object drawing mode off. The second one I used with drawing object mode on, and we can see that it is a drawing object. So the differences here are that I can simply click and drag the drawing object, but if I try to do that to the shape, it actually treats the fill and stroke separately. So what we can do is double click upon that shape and then move it. We could also go ahead and group this, and it would behave very similar to the shape. So if I do modify, group, now if I click and drag, it behaves similarly. However, it's now a group. I can't access the actual shape bits unless I either break it apart or double click to go within it. We can see we're in the group now. Let's delete those. And let's have a look at the second type of rectangle tool, which is the rectangle primitive tool. The rectangle primitive tool is very similar to the rectangle tool working in object drawing mode, except you have some additional options in terms of the actual corner radius to your tool. So let's draw out a shape with this tool. I'm going to simply click and drag just like that. Ooh, and you can see I made it a little too big, but that's okay because with this selected, I can always modify it. So for the width, we can just move it down like that. And I happen to know, of course, that we're at 550 pixels wide. So punching that in there will work. And I also know that I want this positioned at X0 and Y320. I also don't want a stroke here, so I can choose the stroke and just make it disappear. And there I have my floor. Now that we have our floor defined, let's go ahead and lock down that layer so that we don't modify it any longer. And we're going to unlock our circle layer. And upon the circle layer, we will draw out a circle. Similar to the shape tools for drawing a rectangle, there's the oval tool and the oval primitive tool to work with circles and ellipses and ovals and things like that. So let's choose the basic oval tool first. And we can pick a different color here. So maybe I'll choose this kind of blue color. And for our stroke, again, we don't want to have any stroke, just fill. So I'm going to select that first this time. And with our oval options, we actually have some interesting things here. We can start and end angles so that it isn't a complete ellipse. We can choose an inner radius and so forth. And this is just the regular oval tool. If we look at the oval primitive tool, it has very similar options. Let's choose the oval primitive tool. And I'm going to draw out this circle here. To make a complete circle, when you click and drag, just hold down Shift, and that will keep it as a circle. So this is about 90 by 90. That's perfect. And if we want to modify the different options of our oval, you can see how that kind of works here. If you wanted to make different shapes, like that looks sort of like a pie chart, and you can choose the end angle too, and you can make little pieces and so forth. So that's kind of interesting. We can also choose an inner radius, which is going to make our circle into more of a ring. But we just want a normal circle for this project, so there is our circle. Now that we have both our circle and our floor defined as basic shapes, what we can do is unlock all of these and look at how to align different objects. So of course we can always click and drag and position things, and you can see here that we get these guides that show up as we position things near one another and near the edge of the stage and so forth. But what if we wanted to, really precisely align these objects? This is where the Align panel comes in, and you can find that right here. It looks like this, and if it doesn't show up, you can always go to Window and then choose Align from these options, and it'll show up for us. So we have two basic options when working with the Align panel. We can choose to align objects to the stage or not. If we do not align the objects to the stage, it's going to assume that we have multiple objects selected, and then we want to either distribute them, align them to one another, match the size or space, and so forth. In this case, we really don't want to do any of that. We just want to align it to the stage. So for the circle, we want to align the circle to the horizontal center, so we'll click that, and also the top edge. So there we go. Now I actually want it to start off about 10 pixels from the top edge. So what I can do is I can always click my arrow key down with the circle selected 10 times, and that's going to move it 10 pixels. Or I can actually hold down the Shift key and press the arrow key once. That's going to automatically make the arrow key be worth 10 pixels of movement. Now that that's done, I can choose my floor, and I want to align my floor to, once again, the horizontal center, and also align it to the bottom edge. Now we have both our circle and our floor aligned. I'm not going to want to do anything else with the floor at this point, so I'm simply going to lock that layer to ensure that I don't go ahead and do anything to that layer or its contents that would mess up the rest of my composition. Before we move on to animating this project, let's go ahead and see how to preview the project within Flash Professional. One of the nice things about targeting Flash Player or Air is that everything that we preview is going to preview within Flash Professional in an embedded Flash Player instance. So let's go ahead and choose Control. And here we can just choose Test. We can test movie, and in Test Movie we can specify whether we want to test the movie inside of Flash Professional or in the browser. If we choose in the browser, it'll actually open up the web browser for us and create an HTML file, a SWF file to play back within Flash Player, and it'll launch that browser with that content. It's a lot easier to simply test it in Flash Professional though. If we were working in Air, we could use these different desktop and mobile debug launchers, or even choose to test over USB on a device. An additional thing we have here is test scene. Scenes are something that are sometimes used in heavy animation projects where you need to split apart an animation into separate scenes. They each have their own chunk of the timeline. And if you wanted to test, say, scene 10 out of 20, you wouldn't want to test from scene 1. You want to test that particular scene. So that's a way you can do that. Let's go ahead and test movie in Flash Professional. If we choose test, that will actually do the exact same thing. All right, so now we see that our SWF is running inside of Flash Professional. And of course, since we don't have any real animation yet, we only have one frame of content. And so we see a representation of that. We have a static circle and a static floor, and nothing's really happening. But that's expected. Let's close that out. One additional note about testing is that you can test your SWF history down here. So notice that I have tested this one time, and it tells us that the SWF that was generated is 177 bytes, and it gives us a date and timestamp. So if I go ahead and test again, you'll notice that it has another log entry for that test. So if we were trying to scrunch this down into the smallest size possible, we could keep tweaking it until it was smaller and smaller by using some of the JPEG compression settings or simplifying our paths or things like that. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and extend our timeline through adding a number of frames to the timeline itself. So you'll notice down here that we have all these different frames numbered from 1 to 80 and beyond. However, I actually only have one frame that's active here as part of my timeline. You'll notice if I try to drag the playhead around, I just can't do it because this particular document only has one frame. So how do we go ahead and add additional frames? It's pretty easy. All we need to do, and I want to add frames to both of these layers, so I'm going to click and drag, just like that, and then go up to Insert, Timeline, and I want to insert frames. So I'll hit Frame. There, it inserts frames across that entire selection span. And as you can see, now when I go ahead and click and drag the playhead around, a number of different things are happening. I can actually do it, for one thing. It's not constrained to frame 1 anymore. But you'll notice as I move it along, down here, the actual time readout for elapsed time, you'll notice my entire animation is 1.2 seconds. And that is, of course, based upon my frames per second for my document, which is 24 right now. It also shows out exactly which frame that we're currently on. So if I wasn't quite sure which frame I'm on, I can always look down here and see, oh, okay, that's frame 18. You'll also notice some of the different symbols we have here across our frames. This little square here signifies that it's the end of a frame span. The frame span being all of the frames beginning with this keyframe at the beginning. A keyframe is signified by a filled or empty circle. An empty circle would mean that we don't have any content on that particular frame, and that's referred to as a blank keyframe because there's no content there. However, a filled circle like this means that there is content, and if I click that, we can see that the piece of content on this layer within this keyframe is highlighted. Additionally, you'll also notice that even though we do technically have time span and our project does cover a number of different frames, there's actually no visual movement yet. And that's because we haven't actually changed any of the properties of these things on additional keyframes, and we haven't instructed Flash Professional to fill in the between frames for us. In order to do that, we need to specify some additional keyframes and adjust the properties of our shapes. Let's go ahead and create some additional keyframes for our circle shape. So the first thing we're going to do is on the circle layer, let's go to frame 15, and we can see that 15 is highlighted down here, so we know for sure we're on frame 15. And then we can go up to Insert, Timeline, and insert a new keyframe. So you'll notice down here that we actually have 2 frame spans now, one based on this keyframe and one based on that keyframe. The next thing we'll do is actually adjust some of the properties of this circle shape. So I'm simply going to click and drag our circle down till it meets the floor right here. And you can also use, of course, the arrow keys if you wish. So that looks pretty good. You'll notice now we actually do have motion if we move things around in the timeline, because this frame span has everything up here, and this entire frame span has it represented down here. The keyframe specifies the change in our positioning properties for this element. Let's go ahead and right-click, and you can right-click anywhere on this frame span here, and we can choose to create a shape tween. The reason that we choose a shape tween and not one of the motion tweens or classic tweens is because shape tweens are only used on shapes, and inversely, shapes can only use shape tweens. So since we're using a shape, we're using a shape tween. You'll notice that there has been a change in our frame span. We've got this little black arrow here that points from this keyframe to this keyframe, and the frames themselves are colored green now. You'll also notice that we are actually somewhere between both these frames, and the ball itself is between that top position and the bottom position. If we go ahead and move this around, we can see the animation in progress right here. Next, what we're going to do is go to frame 30 and choose Insert, Timeline, Blank Keyframe. You'll notice that the blank keyframe has an unfilled circle. Now, what we're going to have to do is fill this with content. So the content we want is we want the ball to drop and then bounce back up and then repeat. So we actually want to copy this content right here. So to do so, right click, copy, and then clicking inside of that keyframe, right click on the stage and say paste in place. Paste in place is going to paste the object at those exact same coordinates from where we copied it. Now we just need to create a shape tween on this span of frames right here. So let's right click and again choose create shape tween. And now we have our ball bounce to the floor and back up. We can test this, so control, test, and see how it loops, just as intended. So right now in our project, when the ball hits the floor, it bounces back up, but it seems to just sort of do so in a very stiff fashion. You would think that the ball would kind of squish down a little bit, and that's going to add a bit of realism to our animation. Let's go ahead and ensure that that happens. So to accomplish this, we're going to use what's known as the free transform tool in Flash Professional. So selecting that, we can then choose our object, and we can see a number of different things here. We have these little handles here, which allow us to squish along each axis or scale appropriately. We also have the ability to skew our object like this. And all I'm doing is clicking and dragging on any of these points. We additionally have the ability to rotate, as you can see here, by simply hovering near any of the corners. The cursor turns into a little rotation symbol. Now, rotating a circle, of course, is going to have basically no effect whatsoever because it is a circle. The last thing we want to see is this right here. So this little dot is known as the transform point. So you can see as I squish things down that they actually all squish in accordance to this point. So if I move this down to the floor, we can see that now it transforms as if this point were pinning the transform. That's exactly what it does. So now when we go down, we get this sort of action. However, this really isn't what we want, because why would the ball start impacting way up here? So what we have to do is actually create some additional keyframes. So to do that, let's go right about here, and we will insert timeline blank keyframe. And now once again, go to frame 1, right click to copy, go into that keyframe we just created, right click and paste in place. Now, right now it's pasted in place up there. So what we can do is actually move this down toward the bottom. So now, for sure, we get that kind of impact. However, we don't want this happening either, so we can do the exact same thing. Let's go ahead and insert a blank keyframe. Then we'll paste in place and shift that down to about there. Now that looks a lot more organic. Let's go ahead and test it inside of Flash Professional. So Control Test. All right, it's not perfect yet, but it's a lot better than it was. An additional tool we have at our disposal inside of Flash Professional when animating content is known as onion skinning. So, for instance, down here, if we wanted to space these keyframes a little better, we might go ahead and choose frame 15 and then have a look at some of these different pieces here. So you'll notice immediately that we have onion skin and onion skin outlines. So let's choose onion skin. All right, so you'll notice a change immediately up here that we can see these sort of ghost frames. And down here as well, we get this little set of controls on either side of the playhead. As I move my playhead, I can see 2 frames behind and 2 frames ahead of where we currently are. So this helps in seeing exactly how things are going to be animating. That part looks really good. However, I'm thinking that we could actually use a little more space when it comes to this frame here. So to change where this keyframe is positioned, all I need to do is click on it to select it, and then click and drag. So I'm going to drag that 2 out. All right, so that looks a lot better. You'll notice that we can also extend the span of onion skin. So here I'm extending that quite a bit, and we can see exactly how the motion looks. So this is a great way to test your animation as you're going through. Now, we looked at some other options down here, and this one was onion skin outlines. So let's turn that on. And you can see how that works is that we actually have the outlines of our object instead of just the ghosted frames. So any keyframe is going to show up normally. However, anything after the current frame will show up as a green outline, and anything before the current frame is going to show up as a sort of blue or purple outline. All right, let's just turn onion skinning off and look at some more controls down here. You'll notice that we have a full set of play controls, so we can step forward and back different frames. We can go to the ends of our animation, or we can just play. And when we hit play, it'll just play through it once. We can also go ahead and choose to loop this. So similar to onion skinning, when we loop an animation, we can choose the set of frames to actually loop. So if we wanted to choose everything, we could expand that selection across the entire frame set and just hit play, and it's going to loop for us right here. However, we can also go ahead and make adjustments to only loop a small portion of our animation. Now, you don't have to use any of these tools, but just know that they do exist in case you need to do some real fine-tuning to your tweens. All right, so as you can see, the animation that we have right now goes very linearly from this point to that point. And between those 2 points, Flash Professional is simply calculating each individual step in a very precise mechanical way. If we want to make this more natural, like say, have it sort of ease in or ease out, there are easing controls within tweens that we can use to accomplish that. So to actually use these easing controls, what we'll do is just select any of the frames on a particular frame span. So here we have 2 main frame spans between keyframes. We have from 1 to 13, and we also have from 19 all the way to 29. So for this first one, I'm going to select any of these frames on the span, and in the Properties panel, you'll notice that we have an ease setting, and right now it's 0, which means completely linear. So we can actually take this to -100 for an ease in, or to 100 for an ease out. And you can see exactly how this affects the tween. So much more natural. What we're going to do though is actually start off with an ease in of about -60. And you can of course type in any of the values if you want to be very precise. And then over here, we'll do an ease out of 60. All right. And I'm actually thinking to make some adjustments here, just in previewing, so that the ball actually stays on the floor a little longer than it does. And of course, you can go ahead and modify your animation and tweak things like this however you want. All right, so now that this has been done, let's go ahead and preview it inside of Flash Professional by going to Control and Test. All right, so you can see here how the ball tends to hang in the air before it drops and after it bounces back up, whereas it accelerates as it gets closer to the floor. So that's exactly the sort of natural motion that we're looking for, and that tweaking the different ease settings in our tweens is going to help us achieve. One additional thing we can always tweak is our frames per second. Generally, you're going to want to set the frames per second before you even start drawing out your stuff and animating and everything like that. So it's a good idea to go ahead and do a small test with a piece of vital animation at a specific frames per second before you actually animate out all your content. Here, however, I'm going to demonstrate what a little bit of tweaking to the frames per second can actually do to improve an animation. So if we test it right now by going to Control Test, we can see that the animation is pretty nice and fluid, but I think we can actually up the frames per second a little bit. That's going to make the animation a bit faster, and it will also probably make it look a little smoother as well. So let's close our preview window, and then with our document selected, so if your document isn't selected, like say one of your shapes is selected here, if you actually want the document to be selected, all you have to do is click somewhere inside of the pasteboard or in a blank piece of the stage, and that will select the document for you. You'll notice it says document here, and you have things like your publish settings and your stage properties. So here's where you actually find your frames per second. Now you can click on here and type in whatever you want, and you can also up this up and down. So you can go all the way up to 120 frames per second, which is going to be very quick. Let's actually see how that looks. So Control Test. And you can see here that that's way too fast. We're actually losing a lot of our frames. You can see how this is disruptive here. So we don't want to do that. Going all the way down to something like 8 frames per second. Let's go ahead and test that. All right, so here we can say it's very, very slow. I'm going to say that we up it from 24 frames per second to 30 frames per second. That's a very slight increase, but look and see when we test exactly what the results are. So you might not notice it very much in a recording, but if you look at it with your eye, the 30 frames per second actually does quite a bit to make this look more realistic and natural in terms of the timing of the ball. Whereas 24 frames per second was almost there, but not quite. Of course, when you're dealing with your own animations, go ahead and try out with tests first any sort of variation on the default frames per second to see what's going to work best for your project. Now that we have a completed animation, we're going to need to publish this for Adobe Flash Player. Now, since we're using a target type in this document of ActionScript 3, we're able to choose any of the different ActionScript 3 based targets. The targets are listed here, so in this case I'm targeting Flash Player 17, but you can also target all the way down to variations of Flash Player 11 or even Flash Player 10.3. Additionally, you can choose air-based targets because these are also based on ActionScript 3. However, for this, Flash Player 17 is going to work just fine for us. To look at the different publish settings, you can click on this Edit Publish Settings button right here. And here there are a number of things to pay attention to. So your output file by default is a SWF, so that's a Flash document that can play within Flash Player. And you can name this to whatever you want. So if we didn't want it to be called p01.swift, we could give it a name like bouncing-ball.swift or something, and it'll always output it there. We can also specify a different directory if we want to publish in. If we were using any sort of bitmap images in here, we can change the overall JPEG quality in here and enable JPEG deblocking. This is all vectors, so this doesn't really matter that much. Additionally, we can compress the audio to certain specific aspects. In this case, again, we don't have any audio, so this doesn't really matter for us. You'll notice then we have this rather large advanced settings area, which can be twirled down or not. Inside of the advanced settings, we have things like compress movie, which we can choose between two types of compression, deflate or LZMA. LZMA is generally better for ActionScript heavy projects, whereas deflate is usually fine for just asset heavy projects. We can include hidden layers, generate a size report, omit trace statements from our code, permit debugging remotely, protect from import with a password, enable telemetry, which is going to allow us to use products like Adobe Scout in order to monitor exactly how many resources different things are taking to process in our movie. This is mostly useful for ActionScript 3 heavy projects. You can also set a script time limit, so in case some particular script times out, you can allow it to time out after a certain number of seconds. And then you have your local playback security, so accessing local files only or network only. Using Flash Player, you cannot do both. You can also choose the level of hardware acceleration. By default, it's going to be none. You can also do direct, and direct is going to allow you to use the Stage 3D APIs, which allow for true 3D inside of Flash Player. Or you can choose level 2, which is GPU-based acceleration of the normal display list. We're just going to choose none. Now note that almost everything that we just went over in these advanced settings really are advanced. These are for if you're doing heavy application programming, most of them. So in the case of our bouncing ball animation, we don't care that much. You can always just ignore that entire section and it'll be fine. Some of the other options you have here, you're able to export a SWIC, which will basically just bundle up all the assets in here and make them available for you to import into other projects. By default, Flash Professional will also use a HTML wrapper, and this is going to be sort of like a starter HTML page that kind of shows you how you might go about embedding your Swift movie inside of Flash Player in a web browser. So you can use this or not. By default, it's checked. If you uncheck it, that's fine too. You have a GIF image. So if you wanted to generate an animated GIF of the bouncing ball, you could actually do that from here. You'll notice playback is static by default, but you can change this to animated and loop continuously. You can also export a JPEG image, a PNG image, or SVG images. Right now, we're targeting Flash Player, so all we really care about is the SWIFT. You can publish directly from here, or you can just hit OK to save these settings. And you can go to publish anytime by choosing File, Publish. You'll notice a little dialog box just popped up that said Publish, and it published so fast that it went away almost as soon as it appeared. It's because our project is so tiny. Now you'd be able to take that SWIFT and either give it to someone to play back, or you can of course publish it to the web for playback inside of Adobe Flash Player. Now publishing a standalone SWIFT and sending that to people might not be the best idea, because people won't be able to just play the SWIFT if they don't know what to do with it in terms of downloading and installing a standalone version of the Flash Player, or even finding some way to open it up inside of a web browser. And even if they do figure out how to do that, it's not going to be the ideal experience. So something else that Flash Professional allows is for you to take a project and distribute it by bundling the Flash Player along with your SWIFT file into a little standalone executable application. This is known as a projector. And if you want to generate something as a projector, all you need to do is go to Commands, and here you'll see Export as Projector. If we choose this, we get this small dialog box where we can specify an output location for the projector file. And you can see here that we can choose either a windows.exe executable file or a mac.app file. So I'm going to choose both of these and hit export. You'll get this window that says export in progress. And then once it finishes, in the output window, you'll get po1.exe and .app generated successfully. So if I go ahead and run that executable file, you can see that it actually runs all by itself inside of Adobe Flash Player as a standalone executable. This is what's known as a projector, and there are a number of different things we can do with this. We can maximize this to be full screen if we like. And we have a number of different options. So we can exit from here. We can view these different view controls, and this is generally what you see if you right-click on a Flash Player movie like this. You also have different controls, so whether it should play or not, whether you want to rewind, step forward or back, so these would be 1 frame each, and to loop. You've also got a help section, which brings you to About Adobe Flash Player. So a generator is a really good way to send somebody something that you've created that they can view right away and not have to rely on any additional software in order to do so.